Hi, so my name is Kelsey, and I'm making this video for my own reference and for my son's reference to come back to once we are over this hurdle of ours. I wanted to remember everything along the way. And then if this story can help anybody, I would definitely like to pass any knowledge I can along. So our struggles, our awareness of our struggles started when my son was born, which was April of 2014. He had thrush 5 times in the first 4 months of life and lots of yeasty diaper area issues. And we went to a naturopathic doctor. She told me to, at about 4 or 5 months, he developed full-on eczema, and I brought a couple pictures up. Let's wait for this to focus here, if it will. So he had full-on eczema all over his body. It was horrible. And I tried all sorts of natural salves. Nothing was fixing it. It might clear it up a little bit, but nothing was fixing it. So our naturopath suggested that I do an elimination diet because I was breastfeeding and he hadn't had any solid foods yet. So I cut out dairy, gluten, and eggs, being that those are the most common food allergens in babies, and we saw hardly any significant changes. So then she suggested, being that we dealt with thrush so many times, back and forth, that I might have a Candida issue, a Candida overgrowth issue. So she suggested that I try the Candida diet, and we saw some improvement, but still not enough that I felt that we were actually on top of anything. So I went back to her, and she sounded irritated and just suggested getting a prescription for his eczema, which I was not okay with. So I know I'm stubborn. So we switched naturopaths, and as soon as we went to this new doctor, she suggested getting an IgG food intolerance blood test on both of us. And so food intolerance is not food allergies. My son's came back with a slight intolerance to yeast, but really he hadn't been introduced to any foods yet, so his body hadn't developed any antibodies to any specific foods because he hadn't been introduced to any yet. So, but mine was off the charts for yeast. I was extremely intolerant to yeast, which I had no clue before this whole story. And a handful of other things, but yeast was my biggest one. So at this point I was thinking, okay, I have Candida overgrowth and I'm intolerant to yeast. That's the perfect storm. And this new doctor also suggested that I get Candida tests done. We did a fecal and blood test, and both came back negative. I'll come back to that. So at this point, I figured, okay, I don't have Candida overgrowth, but I do have an intolerance to yeast. So I have to cut out all foods that feed yeast or contain yeast. So that means fruits. Yes, even fruits would set me off. No sugars, no fruits, natural fruits. Everything had to be low carb, no starches. So basically I could only eat low carb vegetables and meats. And at first that was really, really hard for me. And no dairy. I was eating some low carb nuts like almonds, but I could only tolerate those in moderation. Anyway, so this was a very new thing for me, and it was completely overwhelming. But as long as I did that, I could continue breastfeeding Liam, and he was fine. As soon as I figured out our food intolerances from that IgG blood test, his eczema completely went away, and we haven't had any issues like that. You saw those pictures. We haven't had anything even remotely close to that since, and he's 2.5 now. So, the naturopath, mentioned something about leaky gut, and I was really curious as to what that meant. So I did some research, and in case you aren't aware, I'll just summarize. So this is actually very common. If you have holes in your gut lining, and if you have undigested food that enters your intestines where the leaky gut is present, then undigested food particles can actually go through those holes in your gut and enter your bloodstream. Well, at that point, that little piece of food is an invader, and your body reacts to it as such. So it will attack it and create antibodies against that food. So the next time that you eat that, you have a reaction. It might not be a full-blown reaction, where you need an EpiPen or something like that, but it could just be headaches, or it could be rashes. It totally depends on how your body reacts, but that is what leaky gut is. And there are lots of things that contribute to leaky gut, and you'll see there's a lot that you can do to fix it as well. So in my research on leaky gut, I talked to a few friends, and one of them mentioned the GAPS diet, and I also hadn't heard of this before either. I could go off and I could go off forever about this topic, but so the GAPS diet stands for Gut and Psychology Syndrome. It was developed by Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride. She's a neurosurgeon in the UK. So the book is called Gut and Psychology Syndrome. Her son was diagnosed with severe autism when he was 3, and she actually she set to work healing him with diet and other lifestyle changes, and she successfully healed him. So she talks about how 90% of your body's cells are actually in your gut. You have a lot of good and a lot of bad bacteria in your gut, and they need to be they need to balance. They both need to be there, and they both need to balance. And a lot of your mental health depends on that. So anyway, with this diet, let's see here. Sorry, my chicken scratch. So it's a gut healing diet. And there's the GAPS intro diet, which is very strict, and you gradually introduce new foods in until you get to the full GAPS diet. So I jumped right in. I got the book, read it, was blown away, wanted to implement this right away. So I started the full GAPS diet, and it incorporates a lot of homemade bone broths and fermented foods. So the bone broth is for nourishing and restoring tissue in your gut, so that slowly heals your gut lining, while you also introduce homemade fermented foods like sauerkraut, pickles, kimchi, and the fermented foods, they contain the good bacteria that your gut needs to work properly. So you are supposed to have a lot of those too, to just to feed the good bacteria in your gut. And most people need 2 years on the GAPS diet to fully heal, but and for some it's a lifelong thing because their system just loves it. But that is a quick summary of what the GAPS diet is all about. So I jumped in. I didn't do the intro right away. I did the full GAPS diet, and then come to find out, I had a friend. So the same friend actually who mentioned the GAPS diet to me, she one day was like, wow, you have a lot of amalgams. And I was like, what is that? I had 8 huge amalgam fillings, and let me get a picture up here. So this was one side of my mouth, and the other side looked the same. So on my molars, I had huge amalgam fillings, which are mercury silver fillings, if you don't know the dangers of that. And if you have amalgam fillings, it's very common that you have Candida issues. So I was like, oh, maybe I do have Candida issues, like I thought originally. And okay, chicken scratch. So I didn't realize that every time I ate, every time I drank something hot, every time I brushed my teeth, I was emitting mercury vapors, which my body absorbed, and it went to my son in utero, but it was also going to him constantly through my breast milk. So even though breast milk is very, very helpful for building a good gut flora, it can also be very damaging. But thankfully, this part is reversible, and I'll get to that in a second. But I had no idea until then that all this hot soup that I was drinking was just emitting more and more mercury vapors into my breast milk, and yeah, harming me as well as my son. So I backed off of GAPS. I was very frustrated at this point. Backed off of GAPS and just went back to just treading water, avoiding the foods that set me off. And I was not ready to wean my son from the boob yet. So and we weren't able to afford getting my amalgams removed yet. So it wasn't until April of 2016 that I got them removed. And thankfully, along the way, another friend mentioned the Andy Cutler chelation protocol. So if you haven't heard of chelation, what that is in summary, you remove mercury and other heavy metals from your body. It's a slow process if done properly, but it is very worthwhile to do it right. So I did a lot of research on that, and if you are curious, you can look up the Andy Cutler Chelation Think Tank on Facebook. It's a great group